Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. On the heels of the recent federal election, I'm very pleased to be joined by three people very well versed in our industry and also very familiar with the electoral process. They know campaigning, they know elections, they know governing, and almost everything in between. It's been almost a year since they last joined us for a discussion, and wouldn't you know it, we've had a federal election and the makeup of Parliament is almost exactly the same. That's right, as you know, following 36 days of campaign promises on the hustings, just last week, Canadians opted for the status quo. The Liberals have returned to office with a minority government, with the opposition parties holding the balance of power. So what does this mean for our industry? We saw some significant gains in the last federal budget with sector-specific supports, including $2 billion earmarked for aerospace recovery measures. Can we count on this support moving forward? And what about the urgent need for a national plan to take us through the next 30 years? I don't need to tell any of you just how strategic our industry is and how we can play an important role in Canada's economic recovery coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. But is this something that parliamentarians truly understand? As members will know, we had a chat during the election with Perrin Beatty from the Canadian Chamber and Dennis Darby from the Manufacturers and Exporters, and we were all surprised and disappointed on the lack of an economic discussion through the campaign. Now that we are through the election, I'm pleased to be joined by three individuals that can help with these questions and much, much more. Please join me in welcoming three very distinguished individuals. The Honorable Jean Charest, someone our members are very familiar with. He's the chair of AIAC's Vision 2025 initiative. With 30 years of public service, he's one of Canada's best known political figures, a former industry minister, environment minister, deputy prime minister, and Quebec premier, and a fantastic advocate for aerospace. Welcome, Mr. Charest.
Thank you.
And the Honorable John Manley, one of Canada's most highly respected business leaders with an impressive record of public service, serving as deputy prime minister, foreign affairs minister, finance minister, and industry minister. Welcome, Mr. Manley.
Thank you.
And the Honorable James Moore, another outstanding political figure, 15 years experience on Parliament Hill, including garnering a strong reputation as Minister of Industry. Welcome, Mr. Moore.
Thank you.
So it's fantastic to have all of you with us today. We appreciate your time, and maybe let's just jump right into it. You know, all three of you have been through multiple elections. And what is your take on the election results and campaign? And maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Charest, and then go to Mr. Manley and then Mr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Mike, and I'm delighted to join both James and John, who I have a lot of respect for and had opportunity to participate in different discussions with over the years. And so let's start with the beginning and state the obvious. We were mentioning this before the call started, this webinar, is that I've never witnessed an election campaign like the one that we just saw. And to state the obvious again, I mean, what did we actually decide? No one can really pin that down except to say that we're back to where we were before the election campaign. So I found it all noticeable and actually quite interesting that there were no key issues. The pandemic was the backdrop of the campaign, of course. Obviously, Mr. Trudeau thought that the numbers were there for him to garner a majority, which isn't, by the way, no one's offended in Canada in the electorate that a politician would be asking for a majority. That's not the question. The question is why and to do what? And to do what that you can do with the majority that you can't do now. Of course, that case was never made and led us to the outcome that we know now. The other thing I found remarkable about the campaign is that opposition parties, if they get their job right, have the ability to impose themes or issues during the campaign. They were not able to do that. I mean, Mr. O'Toole was his narrative ended up being, feeding or reacting to the narrative of Mr. Trudeau, and then the narrative of François Legault in the province of Quebec, which was frankly quite remarkable that they would all be feeding and talking to that narrative. Now for the industry itself, and I guess we'll talk a lot about that. We'll talk about that later in our questions. I think that it's not bad news. what we saw before the campaign, I think, is more significant than what the campaign was about. And the work that, Mike, that you did with your team in lining up a program that we all worked very hard to get them to move to before the campaign is significant. But I guess we'll talk about that later, is that how do we move now further down that line? But the announcements made before the campaign were a positive sign in regards to the future of the industry.
I would agree with that, Mr. Charest. Mr. Manley, just some thoughts from you.
Yeah, well, first, likewise, I'm delighted to be here. Not only having, as every industry minister does, spent a lot of time on aerospace and defense issues during those years that I was in Canada, but also, I continue as chair of CAE, so I'm on a daily basis still involved in some of those issues. And I'll pick up where Jean left off. This isn't bad news for the industry. Key announcements were made, and the government is as stable as a minority government can ever be. Let's face it, nobody's going to defeat this government in the short term. Nobody would have a rationale for doing so. Minority governments, it's commonly said, typically last in Canada, 18 to 24 months. But an election is caused by something. And it's caused by somebody thinks they can win, and that's either the government or the opposition. So in this case, the government clearly thought they could win their majority. As Joe said, they didn't have an explanation for that. And when the government is defeated in a minority, it's because the opposition parties think they can win, or at least come out ahead of where they went in. So I think that Mr. Trudeau, like him or not, is in a pretty strong position because the outcome is somewhat binary. And you know what? He's the guy that's going to Rideau Hall to form a government, and not Mr. O'Toole. So I think you have to say he's got a number of years. He may have a full term ahead of him if he wants it, and very little risk of being defeated. So he can really govern issue by issue, and I think fulfilling the commitments that he made to the industry are going to be part of that as Canada seeks to really redefine an industrial plan that can carry us forward. I think there are a number of other things, though, that have emerged. One is we have learned over the last 8 months that the America First policy of the United States was not something that was unique to Donald Trump. And so we have got to build our own strategy. There's a number of examples for that I can take you through, but the most recent one, of course, is even though Canadian vaccination rates of those eligible are approaching 90%, the US border is still closed to Canadian travelers by land. We have no greater say in Washington with Mr. Biden than we did before. And I think we have to accept that as the new status quo. So building our industries and our assets according to Canadian strategic priorities is going to be what the government is going to have to do. And I think that is a very important advantage for the aerospace industry, where we already have a world-leading position.
Some interesting implications coming out of the election already, and just the broader geopolitical status. Mr. Moore, some thoughts on the results in the campaign and where we're at now.
Yeah, and like my two colleagues again as well, thank you for the privilege of the platform and to have a discussion on the campaign. A few things come to mind. First, 5 of the last 7 elections have resulted in minority parliaments. And the 2 that weren't minority parliaments were kind of sort of extraordinary circumstance. One was Stephen Harper in 2015 seeking an unprecedented 4th consecutive mandate, which has never been done before at the federal level in Canadian history. And, Justin Trudeau's inspired campaign and all that, time for change. And you had the NDP and the Liberals in 2015, both saying that the number one issue in the election campaign, the number one focus was the need to get rid of Stephen Harper. And the NDP said, that's why you need to vote for us. And the voters said, you're exactly half right. We do need to get rid of Stephen Harper, but it's the other party that governs, not you guys. And so it was an extraordinary circumstance that led to that majority. And then, of course, in 2011, it was the extraordinary circumstance of the rise of Jack Layton, the collapse of Michael Ignatieff, and three prior minority parliaments that were increasingly dysfunctional. So in recent memory, over the past, basically since Prime Minister Chrétien's majority in 2000, November 27th of 2000, since then, those are the only two circumstances where you get a majority. And it's no wonder Canada is a continental nation with deep divides between suburban, urban, and rural, east and west, francophone and non, indigenous and non, and generational gaps in terms of what the issue set priorities are. You have younger Canadians who are worried about owning a home and climate change and reconciliation, and older Canadians who are worried about retirement and job security and other issues. And we are increasingly balkanized as a country along different fault lines than I think what politics has ordinarily been able to absorb and triage. And so I think that's a longstanding concern. On the results themselves, the election that no voter wanted was received by the voter and thrown back at the politicians with a result that none of the politicians wanted. Prime Minister Trudeau didn't get a majority. Aaron O'Toole didn't get a government. The Green Party didn't get a leader. Maxime Bernier is still Maxime Bernier. The Bloc Québécois didn't get a strengthened mandate to speak for Quebec, quote quotes. And the New Democrats had no breakthrough whatsoever. In fact, they have more. The NDP has more seats in Edmonton than they have in Toronto and Quebec. So they're a diminished party as well. So I think everybody comes out of it limping. To I think John's point, though, that this is a stable minority parliament. Obviously, numerically, the Prime Minister could do effectively what he wants. But his press conference yesterday, I thought, was appropriately humble. Reappointing Minister Freeland to her two positions and the two hats she wears, I think, was a strong signal on the economic side that it's going to be as it was. And on the social side, saying that his dominant priority, of course, is going to be COVID-19, was a mirror back to the public that I heard you, I get it. And not only is there going to be no appetite for an election campaign, I think genuinely there will be no appetite for an election campaign until those ICU numbers are not single digit across the country, but at an absolute zero. The public will not tolerate further sort of political gamesmanship until we have COVID well behind us and we can turn the page onto other issues.
Thanks for that. You raised some interesting points on, the regionality, some of the different questions out there, maybe the ballot box question. And I'd mentioned in my opening remarks, we had a discussion with Perrin Beatty and Dennis Darby, I think it was the second to last week of the campaign. And we were all sort of very surprised, disappointed that the economic piece and the recovery and how we're going to economically come out of the recovery in different sectors, where aerospace, quite frankly, is well positioned to help lead the recovery on some of these matters, with 80% of what we do exported. But maybe from your perspective, why wasn't the economy and key sectors discussed to a greater degree? Was that, to Mr. Moore's point about ballot box questions, the influence of the pandemic, regionality based? Not sure. Mr. Charest, I saw you came off of mute, so that means you're chomping at the bit. You have something to say. So maybe I'll go Mr. Charest and Mr. Moore and Mr. Manley.
Yeah, and I guess we don't want to, be mechanical and taking turns here as we. I just want to remind, it is interesting that during the whole campaign, no, we didn't get a lot, very, very little on the economy. And by the way, the government had delivered its plan in the budget, the $100 billion plus 8-year investment plan. One element of context that's relevant to our industry, though, everywhere in the world right now, there is a renewal and a push for aggressive industrial policies. And I think one of the things we're seeing coming out of this pandemic is the return of big government, but also what does that mean? It means industrial policy. And I just came from Europe. I was in Rome and France on business, and it was remarkable how the European Union, France, and Germany Germany just came out of their campaign, are all actively debating what the industrial policy should be. Now, it has a lot of components to it. A good part of it is supply chains and securing supply chains, redundancy, and for these countries on critical issues like PPE and pharmaceuticals, for example, but also critical minerals. And it has a big security bent also. And the same is true, and I deliberately didn't mention the United States, but what Mr. Biden is doing in the United States is a very aggressive industrial policy, and that's where the world is moving. Now, that's not bad news for the industry because it means aerospace is a big part of it. In Europe, Mike, aerospace is a big part of it. The Americans, the French, for example, when I'm over there, they have their trade numbers out. They were disappointed that their trade deficit was higher than that they anticipated. Why? Aerospace. That's the reason. That's the direct reason. They said, we are not selling and have not sold as many airplanes and than we usually do. So they get the connection. And we can talk also about that. They have in Europe been much more aggressive in putting together industrial policies for the aerospace industry than we have. The last thing on backdrop, it's still, remarkable in the campaign that how little was said about how do we actually manage our budget coming out of COVID. We've raked up high deficits. How are you going to get back into balance? And you could tell that no one wanted to go there, literally. No one wanted that discussion. So we're just going to pretend that it's not going to happen. We're just going to talk about, and Canadians cued into that and probably are fairly disappointed that at least they weren't getting some echo of how things will be handled or managed once we're out of this and get back to a different or more normalized budgetary system.
Excellent insights. So, Mr. Moore.
Yeah, well, I'll just on the economic point. I mean, yeah, people talk about there was only one party that saw its raw vote totals go up, and that was the People's Party, up to 850,000 Canadians. And it's easy to dismiss the fringe elements and Maxime Bernier himself, but Maxime Bernier wasn't in the leaders' debate. Frankly, he communicates poorly in one of Canada's official languages. He is ineffectual interpersonally, I find. The concept of Maxime Bernier is better than the reality of Maxime Bernier. And he won 850,000 votes across the country. And a lot of those votes, yes, they were people who were using ridiculous rhetoric about tyranny. It's kind of crazy, the idea that we should have some sense of social solidarity in the fighting against an infectious disease, and that's considered tyranny. I suspect Maxime Bernier should have a phone call with the two Michaels, Kovrig and Spavor, to find out actually what real contemporary tyrannical behavior might look like. But but that said, there were a lot of people who voted for the People's Party because they were the only people who were sort of shooting a flare up in midnight darkness and saying, wait a minute, how are we going to pay for all of this? And the Conservative Party has, in this campaign, certainly abandoned fiscal responsibility as a central plank for its platform. And at some point, of course, all of these promises of endless spending are going to come home. Canada is the sixth most indebted country in the world, extraordinarily over leveraged, of course, privately on real estate. National, subnational levels of government have never seen this degree of indebtedness proportionately, and our ability to pay for it over time with rising interest rates eventually, and these sort of baked in costs of entitlement spending is going to be utterly unsustainable. And if the next parliament is going to be all about horse trading on new social spending, at a certain point, as Margaret Thatcher bluntly put it, socialism does require capitalism to pay the bills. And so that conversation of economic growth will eventually replace the conversation of socially responsible caretaker government for the course of a health emergency. That will abate, and the conversation about how are we going to pay for all this and the engine that needs to spin off the revenue that can subsidize all this, that conversation will be back front and center. I think in the background, most parties recognize that and know that, but there certainly wasn't any evidence that was in evidence in the campaign that was a conscious, proactive need of the country in the immediate years.
Thanks for that. Mr. Manley, as a previous finance minister, Any thoughts?
Well, I was able to wrestle half of our surplus away from Mr. Chrétien and put it against the outstanding debt. Well, the rest of it went to other spending programs. So those were the days of surpluses. And by the way, we ran 12 in a row, different governments that put Canada in a very good position when we went into the global financial crisis in 2008. You know, I don't know, I'm totally on side with James' comments about fiscal responsibility. I guess, you know, when you think about Mr. Singh's platform, our fundamental problem in Canada, we just don't have enough billionaires. Because apparently we could just go tax them and all the problems would go away.
All 46 of them, John.
Yeah, plus, you know, as my former boss used to say, there's nothing as scared as $1 billion. It can move fast. So, you know, I think this sort of lack of realism that has invaded the public is a problem. And I don't really blame the public or the politicians. I mean, quite frankly, when we took on the deficit in a major way in the early 90s, it was literally force majeure. We were on the brink of not being able to sell Canadian government bonds. And it wasn't the practice at the time that the Bank of Canada would just go buy them like they've been doing during this crisis, because funnily enough, we thought that might be inflationary. And we are seeing a rising level of inflation. But I think there is a piper that's going to have to be paid at some point, and I hope that it's not force majeure or some external threat or issue that causes a dawning realization that you know, this circle just needs to be squared, because this industry will certainly remember when we had to do the big cuts. Industry Canada lost half its budget. And one of the big things we lost was the Defense Industries Productivity Program, which was the lifeblood of the aerospace industry at the time. And we managed to claw it back a year later with a different program, different construct. But when you get into those dire circumstances, getting an exemption from the effect of it is hard to come by. I would make one comment on Jean's discussion around the industrial strategy and how that's emerging. I think there are a couple of things really. One is, this is not your grandfather's industrial strategy. Your grandfather's industrial strategy, or mine might be your grandfather, I don't know, but you know, when we talked about industrial strategy in the past, it had a large government action component. And if we learned anything from the pandemic, I hope that it is the government cannot do big things by itself. It's got to have partners, and they need to be partners in the private sector, in business, in NGOs, in the charitable sector. I mean, the Canadian government did try to develop vaccines, and they did so by adopting a Chinese partner that then pulled out of the deal. And we were left having to go to the private sector to get vaccines. We still don't know how much we paid because we were a little bit slow on the uptick in getting those contracts. When the vaccines came to us, they did not come from our closest friend and ally, the longest undefended border in the world. They came from Europe. So first of all, it's going to mean lots of partnership and partnering, because government is weak on the delivery mechanisms, on the execution side. Second thing is, and I think Jean made this comment, there's got to be an emphasis on what are strategic necessities for our country. What do we have to have? You'll remember early in the pandemic, President Trump attempted to cut off the export from the United States of PPE, including to Canada. Even though many of the raw materials went into the US from Canada, he was going to cut them off. Now, that didn't last too long, and we ended up getting stuff from the US. But domestic capacity in some key sectors is going to be what many countries are looking at because of the threat of geopolitical disruption, of supply chain disruption, of other effects. And I think it's going to require some very careful thinking on the part of government to decide, because this goes quote totally against where we've been for the last 30 years in globalization and international trade. We've now got to think it's not our comparative advantage, but we need it, and we must have capability in certain key areas. That's a different industrial strategy than the ones we used to talk about in the past.
That's interesting, Mr. Manley, how you put that on the strategy piece, because it is different. You know, if I could just encourage you to, think back, put on your industry minister hat from when you were there. You know, we have a new parliament in place. There's a different makeup. You know, you sitting as the industry minister with this makeup of parliament, what are the opportunities for aerospace? And Mr. Manley, to your point, how does the industry come to the minister and start to build that case? Any advice on that piece to say, as you're starting to think about these longer term pieces, which I hope that they are, how is aerospace strategically placed there? And maybe I'll throw it open to whoever wants to jump in.
Well, let me start, because I was there a long time, 7 years. I think Jean was there 7 weeks or something like that.
It was a summer job.
I inherited his car and driver, but I often talk to the new industry ministers when they come in, and I may have said this to you, James, when you came in, because you were very kind to give me a call and ask me what I was, what I could tell you. One of the things that I would lose sleep over was that Canada is a target for many other countries that would love to steal our aerospace industry. It is a crown jewel for Canada. It is not easy to develop, and every other country would like to have what we've got. And so if you're going to have a successful economy, yes, you want to talk about growth, you want to talk about new industries, you want to talk about carbon neutrality, but first, don't lose what you've got and recognize how valuable and important it is. I'd make that as point one.
That's helpful. I'll leave the floor open to who.
I agree with that. I certainly agree with that. John also didn't mention, when you go, by the way, and many people on this call, I suspect, who have been to the minister's floor in the CD Howe building, will also know that when you walk into the main foyer there, you look left, you look right, there's a massive long wall of every industry minister in Canadian history, starting, I think, down on the left side with like handlebar mustaches and mutton chops, all the way up to the right-hand side of the current Minister Champagne. And I used to tell my staff, just remember, that's called the wall of humility. If you think you're really important, at some point, you're going to slide down that wall and all that. But everything John just said about.
James, I always thought the portraits should be sized according to the length of time you were in the portfolio.
Yes, of course you would say that. But it turns out your 8x10 is near my 8x10. But no, but certainly everything you said about the aerospace sector is well true. And it's a mindset. it's interesting, you think about Saskatchewan and Potash or SaskTel and some of these crown corporations. We're desperate to hold on to governmental institutions, but we don't recognize the incredibly more complex, more important, and more valuable private sector collaborations that are also in our face, that also need, I think, a little bit more care than governmental crown corporations that we often rush to in a panic to hold on to when there's frankly no real need to, and is often the case. Everything you said about the sector is entirely true, and I think I would just offer tactically for those in the call and those in the industry. Minister Champagne was reelected. He was only put into this position in January of this year, if memory serves. So he hasn't been there for a long time. But he's a very smart, thoughtful, ambitious person, and I think ambitious person in all the right ways. He's got a lot of energy, and I think to a lot of relief to folks, not only Minister Freeland sustaining her position, I suspect Minister Champagne will stay where he is. If you look through the sweep of Canadian history, when governments are reelected and sort of a subtle message is sent by voters, either change things up a bit or stay the course. I suspect half the cabinet, more than half the cabinet, will probably stay in their current portfolios, and I suspect Minister Champagne will as well. So all of those of you who have been, frankly, spending money and burning a lot of sweat equity to try to make your case within ISED and with the minister, I think that will still be time well spent. Some bits of advice. I think the goalposts do need to be moved a little bit in terms of, rather than, frankly, pushing after some of the spend that was put on the table for the pandemic and sort of industrial sectoral supports. I think the goalposts will now be moved to a longer dynamic of economic growth. And in that context, I think any firm, as much as you can, frankly, put a Canadian lens on it and not a regional lens on it, I think that will have a lot more purchase and support within the Parliament of Canada. And I think it's an important thing to talk about these as Canadian institutions and particular projects as well, like CF-18 replacement. This is not a can that can continue to be kicked down the road. And that's a big ticket item that has a lot of constituent parts and a lot of supply chain issues and all that. And I think some pressure on that for the government to move forward with its process on CF-18 replacement, I think, will be timely in the near future, because it's not a politically popular conversation, because frankly, progressive voters, they view any money spent in that area as money that's not being spent on social spending for NDP Liberal switch voters. And so I think the rebolstered case for investment in that part of aerospace is something that should be done in the very near future.
And Mike, just to add to what both John and James have eloquently described, reminds us that we have to forever accept the fact that we have to remake our case every time, after every and return. And in this in the circumstances in which we are now, the government, given its financial situation, is going to need to grow the economy. And I think one of the central arguments we have to make, that's obvious to us but not obvious to the Canadian public, is that if you want to grow this economy, if you want us to be more competitive, if you want to create jobs, if you want to create good paying jobs, well, you know what? This industry is the biggest investor in R&D in the country. It's, well over 210,000 jobs, a great workforce, 70 to 80% of what we produce, we export. And we're the answer. And so as John is so pointed out, the government will be selective. I mean, they're not going to just, and that part of the problem is social spending is on. It actually, just to back up a bit, it is unusual that in the campaign that all the parties agreed they should spend more. I mean, I haven't seen that happen. They just all agree we never spent so much, but you know what? We need to just spend more. So how do we pay for it? Well, we're the answer. And we need to position ourselves and remind them that this is the industry that's going to create the economic growth and bring in the revenue that is going to allow you to do that. Now, James points out to a few key files. The defense file is always a complicated one. I mean, procurement and defense in Canada, geez, what a nightmare. And now we've had a big lesson, by the way, if anyone's been paying attention to what happened between Australia, the UK, Great Britain, and France on submarines. I mean, there's lessons to be drawn there. But the defense file, space file, are all areas in which we need to be on top of our game and making the case, and export permits, for example. I mean, I think that if there's one issue for which we need a return to the government on a pretty firm and aggressive basis, is say, listen, you cannot continue to manage the export permit file the way you did in the last few years. I mean, that's just not on. I mean, if you're going to get some growth out of this economy, we need a much more predictable and the ability to read what it is exactly you want to accomplish. Otherwise, you're just tying our hands behind our back.
Thanks for that, Mr. Trey. And it's interesting. I want to go back to the strategy discussion. I think Mr. Manley, yeah, you had some good comments on that. We have the international piece, and one of the things that we've really been talking about is the need for that overarching strategy. Mr. Moore, as you had said, to look out 20, 30 years. That's why we were challenging members of Parliament with our Aerospace Challenge 2050 to look to the future, because you're absolutely right. Our competition is not domestic; it's international. And if we want to lead, we're going to have that strategy that takes into account a lot of those items that you had talked about, Mr. Schrey. And it was interesting because while we didn't hear a national conversation, we held a specific targeted election town hall with candidates such as Mr. Fast, who is the finance critic for the Conservatives, and Minister Champagne, and all agreed that we needed some, with different caveats, but we needed some sort of a strategy moving forward. But maybe just, from the government side of things, what leadership approach should the different parties take with respect to the development of such a strategy? I'll leave it open, but Mr. Moore, you're the only one unmuted, so I'll turn to you first.
Sorry, I'm unmuted on the screen because I muted my mic. On issues like climate change, the government sets long-term goals because the short-term delivery of those goals are really politically inconvenient. I find that on a lot of industrial files, they don't set long-term goals because they're boring and don't move votes in industries that are labor-intensive, therefore voter-intensive. And so there's a lot of sort of short-term, immediate-term thinking, and I think that's what we saw the 2015, 19, and 21 platforms of the two governing parties in the country. So I do think that there comes a cycle in the conversation where something is due. And, the Emerson, I mean, I can tell you, I think I spoke about this last time we had this panel, when I became industry minister, those Emerson reports that were, I know, enormously important, and a lot of the work that went into those two Emerson reports on aerospace and space were a guidebook that were constructively critical, thoughtful, long-term in nature, 5 and 10-year time horizons of responsible, deliverable, with clear guidelines on how to get them done and the sequencing of those policy moves that should happen. And from, Tony Clement, Christian Parody, myself, and then transitioned over to Navdeep Bains, and I think Francois Philippe Champagne, even on some of the remaining bits, there was cross-party alignment on this. And I do think that's something that's, worth pointing out, that I think on a intellectual level, that there is alignment between the two governing parties in Canada about the sector. But I also think it's fair to say that a lot of the people who are sitting around the board of Treasury Board cabinet committees and sitting around the board of the Economic Affairs, a lot of people, frankly, like myself, came into the portfolio with not a tremendous amount of literacy in the subject matter of aerospace. When you take on the job and you take it on responsibly, you drink in a tremendous amount of information, and it doesn't take very long to realize the value of the sector and the importance of the sector. But having a sectoral alignment and consensus view on clear steps that are manageable, deliverable, and make a lot of sense in the Emerson reports was enormously valuable, I think, to the recent successes that have happened on the policy space when it comes to aerospace. And I think a new, more ambitious lean forward with everything that both John and Jean said about the economic nationalism and the threats that are from abroad, I think would be a healthy, responsible, defensive lens on an industry that I think does require some more generational thought.
And it's been interesting, Mr. Trey, I'll just go to you, because we had that discussion during AIAC at the provincial level, and provincial governments are starting to realize the need for a strategy, a framework, exactly as you said, Mr. Moore, that strategic pathway forward to build the industry. And we also had Madame Leroux's report also recommending that. Any sort of thoughts on that? To you, Mr. Charest.
The Leroux report, which didn't get as much echo as I thought, is a great building block. I mean, she produced, frankly, she produced a pretty rigorous report, very much in the style of Madame Leroux. I've known her for years. And I was impressed by the quality of the work that was put into it. It didn't get that much attention. Difficult to get a read from inside the government of Canada of how much they thought the report could be a building block. But from my perspective, it definitely is. And so that's something that we can turn to, and she gave us, the industry, a lot of time to allow us to get our say into our report, and it was reflected in her recommendations. We alluded to one part of it that is going to be critically important. The industry has to definitely, and it's doing it now, plug into the transition. When we talked earlier about industrial policy, the industrial policy we're talking about also is going to be a good part about the energy transition all over the world. So, I mean, Airbus and Boeing and companies and Bombardier, they're all on this, and they should be. And so we need to be very, very aware of that if we want to get any resonance within government on what it is that they're interested in, what they want to support. So I would definitely be on that widget and encourage it a great deal. One word about supply chains. I think I can tell you in Europe, there's a lot of concern about the vulnerability of the supply chains. And it's reflected in the C-Series Airbus story here in Canada, because they have given a mandate to their new president to get some cost savings out of the supply chain of the C-Series. And they're pressing that. And so I think you're going to see a lot. Now, the view in Europe and France in particular is that there needs to be a consolidation of the supply chain. And in fact, while I was there, Minister Lemay, was the Minister of the Economy, voiced some impatience with the fact that it was not moving as rapidly as the government of France wanted it to move in doing that consolidation. So I think the government of Canada may very well be very interested in that. One word about Champagne, who I think very highly of. I think, we've had good ministers, but Champagne, frankly, on this file has been on top of it. He's energetic, and I think those of us who meet him from all parties and all political stripes, actually will probably be hoping that he'll stay in the job, because he knows the file, likes it, and he's been pretty effective.
Thanks for that, Mr. Manley.
Well, I always thought, while everything needed to be said, everything didn't need to be said by everybody. So I essentially agree. Maybe to underscore, when you approach government, you got to understand at some level what their big ticket issues are. And as John has pointed out, for this government, you'd have to say sustainability is probably at the top of their list when we get through the next COP meeting, which is upcoming in the UK in a few weeks. That will be further emphasized. And I think it's very important for the industry to get aligned with that initiative and to underscore at every opportunity with government that this is where they're at, because it's not intuitive to see the aerospace sector as being supportive of what they're trying to do there. Obviously, there are some other things that they think are critical as well. We're about to have, the September 30th National Reconciliation Day. I think we quite frankly, beyond the industry, but in the private sector in Canada, need to do a better job at finding ways to include Indigenous people and their communities in what we're doing, that resonates with this government. And it's one of the things that we need to be quietly developing a strategy around as an industry. I think that's true of the broader diversity puzzle. In the boardrooms, we're talking a lot about ESG. It's becoming table stakes for investment. We saw the announcement yesterday by the CDPQ that of their intention with respect to extraction investments, but on a broader industrial level, being able to put a good ESG face forward is critically important, and it also resonates in this case with government. So I think all of these things need to be kept, very much in mind by leaders in the industry.
And maybe I'll just bridge off of that, Mr. Manley, because I think you gave some, items that we need to be cognizant of looking forward. But maybe to the other two, what are some of the market issues you see coming forward? What are some of the political issues? We talked about making sure that defense spending was moving forward. Mr. Manley, you just talked about the sustainability piece. What are the 1-2 pieces that you see on the horizon that we're going to have to grapple with from an aerospace perspective? And sorry, I should also mention skills training. I mean, that's an absolute huge portion when I'm talking to companies, when we're looking at the recovery, the labor market, and building the capacity and the capability of the workforce in Canada, absolutely critical. So interested in hearing your thoughts on that. I'll go, Mr. Charest.
Okay. Skills training, you present skills training is pretty key, and it's a huge, you'll remember, Mike, back when we did the report on 2025, we really grappled with the language we should use. Should we go to the point of saying it's a crisis? And it's not far from a crisis. I mean, we have labor shortages everywhere. There's labor shortages all over the world, but we have labor shortages. The average age of the worker on the plant floor is about 54 years old in the industry. That's what our report reflected. And there may be an opportunity here, I'm thinking out loud, for the industry to present a common, more aggressive plan to provincial governments in particular, with the involvement of the federal government, to do a labor strategy, which should include, as far as I'm concerned, a very important chapter on experienced workers. We have an aging population, we live longer, and it just doesn't make sense to have these folks retiring at 60 years old, and when they're in their prime, they're healthy, and there has to be, I think that is a pretty urgent issue to address. And we were on a call recently, Mike, you and I, with provincial ministers, and I think they get it. But they're the ones on the first line of this. I mean, they're the ones, the provincial governments are the ones who need to know and be aware of this and move on it. But that could very well be one of the major initiatives of the next year if we chose to do that.
Thanks for that, Mr. Moore.
No, I'm glad John raised the labor issue. It's an important one. And I do think sort of framing the conversation with the government, and I would add, by the way, everybody said complimentary things about Minister Champagne, also Simon Kennedy, right? Simon Kennedy, as deputy minister at ISET, is one of the most impressive people in the senior ranks of the Canadian public service, and he's a very thoughtful person who a random speculation here, but I think probably is on a short list of people who ultimately could rise to the position of clerk. So, having someone who is, as impressive as he is in this portfolio with a returning minister is a good window of opportunity to set in place markers and expectations for the sector that will frankly transcend even a liberal conservative governmental switch or future cabinet shuffles and so on. So I think we're in a window of opportunity here on a number of things. And I certainly agree with Jean with what he said on the labor front. For the sector, reimagining as well how you present the sector to government. Yes, it's an opportunity, but I do think there does need to be a bit of awakening back to sort of where we began this conversation about economic growth, and saying to government, if you're going to take away our ability to earn profit and reinvest it in our company with increasing tax rates, and we don't have supply of high quality skilled workers, and we don't have guaranteed market access to global markets to make investments, and we're not competing with government subsidies and or tariffs that are being put on different aspects of our inputs into our business model, and we're being beaten up culturally in the Canadian media because of our industry and the support and the collaborations that we are engineering in order to survive in this country, then why are we going to continue investing in Canada? And when I was Minister, for example, of Canadian Heritage, Minister of the Arts, one of the requests that I remember that the cultural community said to me, again, within the context of a conservative government, was they said, more than anything, we would like you to be a champion for our sector. We need people to fight and to speak with clarity and consistency in favor of the creative economy and what it means for Canada going forward. And I think that, among other things, would be one of the things that you would hope for from the minister, is to, push back against those voices in Canadian media and supposed informed opinion, who chastise and attack such a critical part of the Canadian economy, and such a critical part of the Canadian economy that is going to be there and have to be there to pay the bills in the out years for the promises of this upcoming spendthrift parliament.
So that's interesting. Maybe if I could just bridge off of that, Mr. Moore, maybe the final question, the minister and the prime minister being a champion of our industry. What does that mean? We're asking for them to support a strategy, but from a government perspective, what does being a champion mean? What can we expect to hear back from them if they truly want to be a champion? Is it the commitment for a strategy from their political perspective? Is it something different?
Well, I mean, it is to have on an index very clear understanding of what the industry is and what it means, and to stand up and speak for it forcefully and effectively. Like, the Prime Minister will very readily and quickly speak out about the values of diversity in Canada, our bicultural, bilingual past, our multicultural present, and our diversity in the future, and how good that is and strong that is for Canada. Well, it'd be helpful if people, whether it's the Prime Minister or the Minister, have the same kind of vocabulary and quick wit and passion when it comes to defending Canada's economy and its key sectors. You cannot get elected the Premier of Ontario unless you have a robust, clear, concise, elevator pitch about how important the auto sector is for the province of Ontario. You're just not getting elected. Same thing is true in British Columbia when it comes to forestry and our sectors, or in Saskatchewan with the agricultural and mining sectors. So too should it be for the Prime Minister of Canada when it comes to key sectors, and aerospace should be among them. And I think the industry can help educate those thought leaders and political leaders in the country to be those voices and champions and fighters for the Canadian economy and its key sectors.
So that's great advice. And just going back to your comment about Simon Kennedy, that the public service that stays there, absolutely critical. Mr. Charest, Mr. Manley, any final closing thoughts?
Well, I think James stated it well. The wish that we all have that. And I'd have to say it's broader than the aerospace sector, that our industry minister would be a champion for Canadian industry. It was advice that I received early on was, you are the minister for business. At the table, you're the one that has to say what needs to be said in support of broadly written business in Canada. And, not every industry minister comes to that intuitively. It's important for organizations like the AIAC and others to make sure that whoever is in that chair at CD Howe's desk understands just what their role is, what their duty is, and how important the industry is.
Thanks for that. Mr. We started with you and we're going to end with you. It's like,
Well,
But your
James,
perspective on that, and especially from your European, perspective, also with respect to, how do some of those ministers champion the industry, et cetera?
well, James was bang on about the champions. By the way, Simon Kennedy. I couldn't agree more. You could add to the list of folks within government, Michael Sabia, who's the Deputy Minister of Finance, recently recruited and was at CPDQ for a number of years, knows the industry very, very well. And he's a key player in all of this. So, I mean, there's a lot there. And I would say our job is to make their job as easy as possible, make them as effective as possible. I mean, and our job is to figure that out. What do we need to do to get, all the ingredients are there. And remember, we're still among the top in the world. We're the only country in the world to be among the top 5 in every category. And it was said, who was it said by John at the outs? John Manley, I think. You're totally right, John. I mean, the nightmare scenario is that, and believe me, other countries are going to come here to pick and try to eat our lunch, including all these emerging economies, and that's relatively new. Think China. So we should be under no illusion that we're in a fight for the future of the industry, and let's just make sure that everyone understands that and that we're all fighting on the same side.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And we've come to the end of our time, and I just wanted to thank the three of you just deeply for coming on, for your support of our industry, both while you had the Minister of Industry hat on, but also afterwards, your expertise and availability to us to provide advice, and also spending time with the members of AIAC through forums like this is greatly appreciated. As I'd mentioned before on our pre-brief, the three of you are becoming fan favorites of the membership, and we're going to be extending an invitation to the three of you when we can get back together in person, hopefully sooner rather than later. And we definitely look forward to that. So again, thank you to the three of you, and thank you to the members also on the call. Greatly appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Mike. John, James.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you guys.